Welcome, friends. Today's topic is on the first Greek philosophers. Next Sunday's topic will be true morality. Every first and third Sunday of the month, we reconvene a few minutes after this meeting for roundtable readings and discussions. This being the third Sunday, we will continue with our studies of the Bhagavad Gita and related notes. All are welcome to come and be with us on Sundays at 11 a.m. here at the United Lodge of Theosophists, 4865A Cordell Avenue, Bethesda, Maryland, as we work to keep the link unbroken for the benefit of humanity. We will read the declaration which this lodge goes by. The policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the Theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis, and it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. The following is a form signed by associates of the United Lodge of Theosophists who choose to do so. Being in sympathy with the purposes of this lodge as set forth in its declaration, I hereby record my desire to be enrolled as an associate, it being understood that such association calls for no obligation on my part other than that which I myself determine. Our reading this morning is from the Dhammapada, here in chapter 7, titled The Sage. He who has thrown off the fetters and freed himself in all ways, he is free from sorrow. For him there is no suffering. He has completed his journey. The thoughtful desert themselves. They do not delight in any abode. They leave their house and home as swans their lake. Those who have no possessions, who nourish themselves according to knowledge, and who realize the goal of freedom by perceiving that life is empty and transient, their path is hard to trace, like the flight of birds through the sky. He whose appetites are slain, and who is indifferent to food, who has perceived the goal of freedom by realizing that life is empty and transient, his path is hard to trace like the flight of birds through the sky. Even the gods envy him whose senses are subdued, like the horses well tamed by the charioteer, who is free from pride and free from depravities. He who is patient like the earth, firm like Indra's bolt, like a lake free from mud, for him there is no round of birth and death. Calm in thought, calm in speech, calm in actions is he who has obtained freedom through true knowledge. He has become tranquil. He is full of repose. The man who is not credulous, who has severed all ties, killed all desires, for whom even occasions to act with like or dislike arise not, who knows the ever-existing uncreate, he indeed is exalted among men. Delightful is the place where Ahas dwell, be it a village or a forest, be it by deep waters or by desert edge. Delightful are the forests of the Arhat. They charm not the worldly. There the passionless find delight, for they are not allured by sense life. And now for today's talk.
Good morning and welcome, friends. Occasionally, this lodge visits old philosophies that was introduced a long time ago, remembering that any philosophy worth that name actually comes from these Greek philosophers, and they're normally criticized and not appreciated. And we need to show gratitude, and this is one of those occasions. The millennium that started with Buddha and Pythagoras in the 6th century BC until the suppression of the Neoplatonists in the 6th century AD is the only focus that is left in history wherein the bright rays of truth streaming from the sun of archaic wisdom converged for the last time, unobscured by clouds of bigotry and fanaticism. So this is what we're going to be talking about. It is the 6th century BC to 6 AD. We have all studied historically. During this period, we know that it was a period where Greek democracy arose. Kings had already given way to the nobles, and they, in their turn, were being replaced by tyrants. Some of these championed the rights of the people, while others became dictators. During this period also, the rise of the middle class showed education to become more generalized. The laws of Greece, which before that time had been oral, were now reduced to a written code. Arts, music, poetry, drama, architecture began to flourish. At no other time in history were there so many temples built in Greece during the 6th century BC. It was at the beginning of this rising cycle of democracy that the Milesian school of Greek philosophy was born. This school was an outcome of the mysteries, and the three men who sponsored it were initiates. Now, mysteries, we know in the mysteries, philosophy, science, religion, and ethics were taught as one. They were not given special names to distinguish them from one another because they were considered the same branch of learning. The word philosophy actually comes from the days of Pythagoras. Before that, the wise men of the East were known as sages. So the first of these wise man is Solon. The second one is Thales. And we're 6th century BC. These wise men were, in the proper sense, philosophers, because they knew, they had knowledge, they knew, but they also were practical men that applied their extraordinary knowledge in different ways, as we shall see. Solon is one of the most famous of the seven, and he used his knowledge of universal principles to establish good government. He was born as a wealthy noble, but he was a friend of the common people. After his election as archon in 594 BC, we see him limiting the wealth of the nobles, releasing all the peasants that had been imprisoned for debt. He established a jury system and wrote out a constitution in which every citizen of Greece had a voice in the government. Thales founded the first school of Greek philosophy in Miletus, a powerful Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor, Turkey today. Thales, who took his name from Thala, who is the Chaldean goddess of personifying the sea, was a prominent statesman, and he was associated with King Croesus in the capacity of engineer. He was of Phoenician parents, and he traveled wildly in the quest for knowledge. He visited Crete, Phoenicia, and Egypt. He studied astronomy in Babylonia, and after he came back to Miletus, he gained tremendous fame by predicting an eclipse of the sun. And it is stated that his initiation into the Egyptian mysteries made it possible for him to write a book on mathematics. So to Thales we owe several propositions later included by Euclid in his Elements. He's also credited with having discovered the electrical properties of amber, but as we know that the science of electromagnetism was taught in mysteries, Thales cannot be regarded as the discoverer of any phase of this science. He was just simply giving it out as he had learned it. So, it appears that at about 600 BC, the time had arrived under the cyclic law for public instruction in some of the teachings which had hitherto been confined to the mysteries. And we all know that that means that we cannot give it out. So this public effort appeared 600 BC. And we also know that for the 2500 year cycle, the secret doctrine was brought out. So if we compare this, it is very easy to see the similarity of the method used by the early Greek philosophers. In the pages of the secret doctrine, in the first part, 3 fundamental propositions appear in a summarized form, and these are illustrated and elaborated throughout the book, that work. The Greek philosophers, the early Greek philosophers, follow the same plan, proceeding by a gradual stage from the first proposition to the second, and from the second to the third. In the secret doctrine, these principles are applied first to the cosmos and then to men. The Greek philosophers employed the same order. The secret doctrine presents philosophy, science, religion, and ethics as they were taught in the mysteries, inseparable from each other. The earliest Greek thinkers, however, concentrated on what may be called the philosophy of science. Philosophy of science. Only Pythagoras, whose school was patterned after the mysteries, used that synthetic method that is present in the secret doctrine. Although the majority of modern philosophers, are willing to admit that every known type of philosophy finds its prototype in the early Greek schools, the old philosophers are often accused of generalization, of a lack of system, and of scientific ignorance. This accusation itself springs from what the Platonists would describe as complex ignorance. Complex ignorance. Or our modern critics. It is the error which permits a man to remain oblivious of his own ignorance regarding certain things. For example, how many of our scholars are aware of the fact that every science was originally imparted to men by divine teachers, thereby becoming sacred and impossible of communication, save during the rites of initiation? How many realize that no initiated philosopher had the right to reveal his knowledge clearly, but was obliged by the law of the sanctuary to conceal the truth under the veil of allegory and symbol? Once this is understood, the seeming ignorance of the early philosophers will be recognized as but the result of obligatory caution. Obligatory caution. The first school of Greek philosophy was founded by initiates who taught under these restrictions. They started to do what all true philosophers do by postulating the existence of a homogeneous substance principle, which is the radical cause of all. Substance principle, homogeneous substance principle. Quote, this is pre-genetic. Homogeneous substance principle. And it is the radical cause of all. Thales symbolized this principle as water, Anaximenes as air, Heraclitus as fire. When Thales chose water to stand for primordial substance, he employed a symbol already familiar to the Greeks. Homer had described the source of all, and this is a direct quotation, as the river ocean, a deep and mighty flood, encircling land and sea like a serpent with its tail in its mouth. Hesiod had declared that chaos was of all things the first produced, indicating that the producer of chaos must be passed over in reverential silence. But long before the days of Homer and Hesiod, the Greeks had learned of primordial substance from Orpheus, who brought from India the archaic doctrine which is itself as old as the world, because we know that it exists from eternity to eternity. This idea opens the cycle of cosmogony in the Chaldean book of Numbers, in the Egyptian book of the Dead, in the Indian Puranas, in the first book of Genesis. Even Wordsworth, in his Ode to Immortality, describes the beginning of things as a dark, immutable ocean without bounds, without dimension, where length and breadth and height and time and place are lost, where all this night and chaos, ancestors of nature, hold eternal anarchy. Anaximenes of Miletus, friend and associate of Thales, is known to the world for his description of the universally pervasive principle in which the earth flows and which permeates every atom. He symbolized it as air. In the single surviving sentence of his writings, Anaximenes says, "Just as our soul, being air, holds us together, so do breath and air encompass the whole world." This is all that is remaining from his writings. The air of which he speaks is, of course, Jiva. And the breath, prana. Of course, they didn't give the terminology, but that's what they're talking about. As Jiva is the highest principle in man, the statement that our soul is air may be taken in this meaning. The breath associated with air, of course, may be understood as prana, which, strictly speaking, is breath, a necessary element for the continuance of life in the human frame. And we know, HPV gives that a sponge example, just like the sponge absorbs water, we absorb prana from the environment around us, and at death it is again released and becomes jiva, and is a general principle. While the world of philosophy is indebted to Anaximenes for spreading these purely theosophical concepts among the Greeks, modern science owes to him a statement of the nebular hypothesis. Anaximenes declared that the sidereal bodies were formed through the progressive condensation of the primordial pregenetic matter, which had an almost negative weight and was spread out through space in an extremely sublimated condition. While Thales chose water to symbolize primordial substance, Anaximenes chose air to describe the one life which animates it. Heraclitus of Ephesus maintained that the one principle underlying all physical phenomena is fire. And in the Secret Doctrine, you can look it up, and fire is an occult element. This is also an old occult symbol, for the esoteric teachings say the fire is the most perfect and unadulterated reflection in heaven as on earth of the one flame. It is life and death, the origin and the end of every material thing. It is divine substance, and this is in Secret Doctrine 1. So fire.
You can erase it if you want.
Is divine substance. Divine substance. Secret Doctrine 1. You can look it up, page 121. However partial their explanation may appear in the greater light of the Secret Doctrine, the world of these ancient Greeks a debt of gratitude for their impersonal concept of deity. From the early period of the fourth race down to the last palmy days of Grecian art, the Hellenes were the only people who raised a public altar to the unknown god. So, impersonality. Although the lesser gods were worshipped in anthropomorphic forms, the unknown source of all was described as it.
Erase.
unknown source, they passed over it and referred to it as it. It is complete, immovable, indivisible, without beginning and without end. Anaximander of the Milesian school called it the source of all, within which all things arise and into which they eventually return. Many of the Greek thinkers symbolize the abstract, ever incognizable presence as a circle or a sphere. Parmenides, saying it is complete on every side like the mass of a rounded sphere, equally poised from the center in every direction. And in the Secret Doctrine, we start the discussion with two circles. One without a point in the center, which represents the world in pralaya, and the next one has a point in its center, which represents the period of activity. And here we see it in the Greek philosophers expressing the same idea. From the point arising within the sphere, the Greek philosophers constructed the mathematics of the universe. So the tendency of the Greeks to anthropomorphize the lesser gods received a strong rebuke from Xenophanes, reputed finder of the Eleatic school. Vain mortals, he said, imagine that godlike themselves are begotten with human sensations and voice and corporeal members. In his humorous fashion, he assured his countrymen that if oxen and horses had hands and could form images of their gods, the oxen would shape God in the form of oxen and horses in the shape of horses, each kind the divine with its own shape and form endowing. So the early Greek philosopher, therefore, must be credited with an understanding of the impersonality of the deity as taught in Theosophy. The second fundamental proposition was clearly stated by Anaximander, who said that there are innumerable worlds which come into being and pass away, some always coming into being while others are passing away. This universal law of periodicity, prevailing in every department of nature, found another advocate in Heraclitus. He affirmed that the universe is pervaded by duality and that the various pairs of opposites, such as day and night, heat and cold, life and death, sleeping and waking, are synthesized in an underlying unity. This unity, he said, is the unity of law. Quotation: the process by which one thing changes into another does not take place in an unregulated and lawless manner. It is rhythmical, kept within the bounds of definite proportions. End of quote. The orderly procession of events under the law of cycles was treated at length by Empedocles. He declared that all things prevail in turn as the cycle comes round and pass again into one another and grow great in their appointed turn. This, he said, brings about the regular recurrence of the seasons, the rise and fall of civilizations, the successive incarnations of men. Empedocles regarded death as an illusion, a mere interval between two lives on earth. One statement made by him might well have been drawn from the Bhagavad Gita. He said, "There is no death for any of the things which perish, nor any cessation for them through baneful death." Empedocles apparently was able to remember some of his past incarnations. He informed his students that in some of his lives he had been a man and in others a woman. In a fragment of his writings, he described his sensations when he again found himself assuming a body of flesh. Quotation: "I wept and wailed he confessed, when I saw the unfamiliar land. I am now a wanderer and an exile from the gods because I put my trust in insensate strife. Empedocles thus described the working of the law of karma, which compels the soul to incarnate again and again until it rises above the attachment to the pairs of opposites, the cause of insensate strife. Empedocles spoke of this law as the oracle of necessity, which follows a man's footsteps until he learns to work with the law. In another fragment, he wrote of one who was willfully polluted his hands with blood, and thus forsworn the law of brotherhood. Such a man, he said, must wander thrice 10,000 seasons from the abode of the blessed, being born throughout the times in all manners of mortal forms, changing one form for another. Now, are these words of ignorant men? Are they not rather the carefully and cautiously phrased statements of those who knew the fundamental teachings of the archaic wisdom, but who were prevented by their pledge of secrecy from giving them out to the world in full detail? In the thought of the early Greek philosophers, many hints of the ancient secret doctrine are evident to those who have eyes to see. These hints, however, will not be understood, even by the greater scholars of the day, until they are viewed against the background of the ancient wisdom, the modern expression of which is found in the secret doctrine. With this standard of comparison, all systems of philosophy, ancient or modern, show their relation to the unchanging truth, of which they are more or less partial representations. So here's another reason why we need to read the secret doctrine and know what is in it, because the comparison actually is made in the secret doctrine because HBB quotes from some of these early Greek philosophers at the beginning to show us that what our discoveries are based on. We just suddenly didn't discover all these elements because they had been discovered before, but as we know, scientists today do not really acknowledge these Greek philosophers and give them due gratitude. But they were there, and they were initiates, and they did start all this philosophical giving out information to the general public, and if we want to verify it, we can do so for ourselves because the secret doctrine is there and we can compare what they said to what is in the secret doctrine. Of course, even though HBB says the secret doctrine was written in the 19th century by just lifting a corner of the secret wisdom, in other words, we are given a very, 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 very small portion of it. She says that that information cannot be put into 10,000 books, and normally it is not given in written form. We saw that at the beginning of this period, when Greece became democratic, the law of the country was for the first time written down. Before that it was verbal. To this day, the initiation process is verbal. It is never written. Each one must experience this for themselves, and until such time, we cannot truly know all of the philosophy that is in the secret doctrine or any one of these philosophical books. And with that, we will open the platform for questions and answers. Yeah. Yes.
Through this talk, the student heard the mention of India once, and if it's possible, can you please explain how the Greeks were influenced from the more eastern countries, how that knowledge came to the Greeks?
As is explained in the books, India was not the India of today, because it encompassed where the Persian Empire was at the beginning. In other words, India was not just the North India, but there was a southern part that went into Russia, all of the eastern parts of Asia, and all the way to the Middle East, because many places at the beginning of the Secret Doctrine, it is stated that those lands are lands of sand today, but they were at that time great civilizations. And she tells you in the Secret Doctrine that some of the local people tell you where they came from ancestral stories that they had heard, and she's referring to the Atlanteans, of course. Fourth, Atlantean civilization. And this, she says, was far greater civilization than what we have today. And in the next sub-race that is coming, more of this knowledge is going to be evident. Why? To answer your question, why? Because Atlanteans are reincarnating on the western side of the lands, meaning here, and all of the old civilizations, she tells us that the Roman Empire lived its life over 2,000 years, but the United States has done it in 200 odd years. In other words, we're now on the down cycle in the United States, and it is going to get a lot worse, she tells us, because this is Kali Yuga before it gets better. So, India then is the seat of knowledge from when? From Vedic lore, she tells you. She's not referring to the India of today, because India of today is full of superstition, she tells us. When she refers us to India of the old, she's talking about Vedic India. And it's the seat of learning, because all of the sages that we just read in that book that are concentrated in the Himalayan platform, where the Buddhists established their homes, and our masters actually are on that side of the world as well. Kashmir and those areas, people know them because they've mixed with the local people, and they know they're safe. They refer to them as wise men, because the local public know them. So, considering that that is the seed, if you read the life of these sages, starting 1st century AD, which is Apollonius of Tyana, it shows you that he traveled all the way from Alexandria through Persia, all the way to India, stayed 13 years, I believe, with the Master's Lodge, or the sages of the East, and they taught him during that period. He was already learned in the sense that he was already initiated into several schools of the mysteries, but when he came back, he gave them a promise before he left that he would distribute this knowledge all across the land. And it is stated that he traveled everywhere, and wherever he went, he cleaned the notions that had seeped into the mysterious schools. He cleaned it out, established new rules and regulations wherever he went, and he uplifted humanity during that 1st century AD. There is no mention of him ever meeting Jesus Christ, if indeed Jesus Christ was a historical character, because according to this philosophy he was not. He came 100 years before this historical era. They didn't say he didn't come, but not in the historical era. So we have the sages of the East all the way from the Himalayan plateau coming to the West. And as they traveled, what did they do? they civilized those nations, Babylonia being one of them. Yeah. And we see all of these Greek sages that we just mentioned, the early Greek sages, there were initiates. So obviously the schools are around, and the first one is Miletus, and initiates started it, and they could not give out their knowledge because they gave that word that they would not. This was just the rule of the sanctuary at that time. We live in the 21st century. We're talking about 600 BC to 600 AD when the Neoplatonic school disappeared, and the temple that held 30,000 people in it was destroyed. So sages of India, if you look at historical facts without bias, are the ones that are actually civilizing the world by traveling from the east to the west and establishing these centers where learning could be achieved by those who were ready to do so, because they had to be initiated. Only with Pythagoras you had 8 years of pre-cleaning before you could face Pythagoras himself face to face. So that purification period was even then there. It's just a different way of saying it. So India is considered as the seat of knowledge, and it is stated from the secret doctrine that those sages of the fourth race actually got it from whom? The gods themselves, if you want to call them gods, because they are the hierarchy referred to as the Dian-Johanic host in the secret doctrine, but nevertheless we can call them gods because they are, because we are on our way to becoming one. So it was India, and of course they have the Puranas as well. Oof. And without the Puranas, she says, we cannot really understand any of the Vedic literature that was written at that time. She's talking about pre-Vedic and post-Vedic. So the old India is what we're referring to here, that encompassed a tremendous area from land perspective. Don't think of India of today.
Is it called Aryavarta?
Sorry?
Aryavarta, is that what it's called in the book?
Well, that's what they are called today, but that's not. Yeah, she says the old masters, she refers to them, she says that they are the ones that are my brothers, and yeah. So, and she refers to a couple Atlantean sages, I can't remember the second half of the name, but it's in the beginning of the secret doctrine. Parasara, something like that. So they passed their information to Egypt, and from Egypt, for the new cycle, went to Greece, because Egypt has many thousands of years of records of these heavenly teachers that came on earth to instruct, and their first human king, it said, is Menes, and that was 3000 BC. So there's a tremendous historical background that we don't know much about, but I'm not sure they would give it out even today. She says that it will never be given to a transition age, which is this, because she says that our values are not based on ethical principles at this time. Some are, but some are not, and they just don't give it because they don't want it to be ransacked and sold for profit, obviously. That's one reason.
So,
Yes?
seems like it's throughout history, you're talking about a period where there was a great availability, at least in the Greek there, in this Greeks, of this knowledge. Here in the West, we don't seem to have that so much anymore. HPV brought it out, and there were efforts throughout history to keep bringing it out, but there seems to be like a vacuum now. We don't have all that around us.
You're saying there's a vacuum now?
Except for, yeah, secret doctrine is pretty well unknown now.
If I can add to that, the student's observation is that there's a lot of information out there, but there's not enough knowledge.
Exactly.
So this platform is a good example. We put it on YouTube, we try to spread it, and it's there for people to find it, but
They have to be interested in it to some degree, because this requires learning process. It's a different learning process. But there is no vacuum ever. HPV says there is not one dot of the space in our world that is not occupied. So take that out of your vocabulary. There's no vacuum. What has happened is, really we have to ask this question to ourselves as students of this philosophy. What kind of job are we doing bringing it? Because she did make that statement during her own lifetime. She sent 5 messages to the American Theosophists of that time saying that you hold the future in your hands. The Western world is dependent on how you are going to disseminate this philosophy, because she's telling us that the skepticism as well as materialism is on the ascendancy. Because materialism was on the ascendancy, the skepticism seeped in. But she's telling us if we do not correct it, we are doomed, because 21st century will not be blooming with roses. And we need to look at it. What happened in the 19th century when she brought it, she continuously reiterated that we needed to be united. This philosophy has its prerequisites for it to become successfully disseminated. Unity is one of them, because that deific principle that we just talked about, which is unnamed by these Greek philosophers because they refer to it as it, is based on one, because the oversoul that animates our world is one. There's only one oversoul, not two. We all come from the same spiritual center. So if we understand this internally, not in words, internally, if we understand that I am part of you and you're part of me, then you would never harm the other human being, because we are all one essence. We come from the same. Not only that, we just talked about primordial substance. It never is created, it always is. In activity, it comes forth, it differentiates into 7 different aspects, and we have the world. In pralaya, it gets withdrawn into the homogeneous, homogeneous gets absorbed into absolute, and we go into rest period. So if we understand these concepts and make it part of ourselves, then it becomes essential that what you have learned, you want to also give it to others. And that is where the question comes in. What happened to the movement in the 19th century? It got divided and divided again. Divided again and again and again. They did not keep the integrity of the movement as one, and they dispersed the energy. When you have fighting factors in the same movement, just like the Christian religion, that it loses its force. It would have done tremendous good to the world if there was only one organization as a center to disseminate the same philosophy that HPB William Kwan Judge brought out from the Master's Lodge, and nothing has been changed. We simply learn it and give it. This student does not understand why all those prominent people at that time, and to this day, everybody is after writing a book. To what purpose? To what purpose are we writing these books? It only takes attention. Attention. It takes away attention from the real and puts it on what? Non-real. Because if this is what they brought out, there is a value to what is being said in those books. And if you can get at it, that's when you are going to go from information to knowledge. To knowledge. And that in its turn is going to become wisdom. There's a progression in this philosophy, and we can't get at it any other way but to have that inner perception that what we're doing is useful, that masters require workers in the field, and that all the help will be given to us according to our intent. Is it that we are looking for title, money, position, power, or are we doing it to uplift humanity and move it towards emancipation from substance, from matter? Because that is what is needed. We need to get back to the spiritual aspect of ourselves and allow that light to come in and make itself known through the perfected or sanctified, clean body, and shine through into the world doing good. And if we do not do our work, then we can't blame as to why the situation is as it is, because the theosophical students have to do this work willingly, cheerfully, and to the best of their effort and knowledge, because this progression is still the same initiation process as in the old. We just don't do it like it was done before. Now it's a different process, but it's the same methodology. It goes from one to the other, from one to the other, and at first a tremendous amount of work and effort is required on the part of the student, but there will come a time when that higher mind will shine on the lower and guide it, and that's when we can achieve a whole lot of work without, not without effort, but without a lot of effort. Because what does HPV tells us? It goes out like lightning and cuts all difficulty asunder. It's in the Gita. So we said that if we want to be counted, then this is the path to follow. Then we can cleanse ourselves, get prepared to stand up and be counted for this work. If we have a title in this line of work, it only indicates what you have undertaken to do. Anything else is not given, because there are no favorites in this philosophy. All you do is give what you can with no expectation of anything in return. That's the path. The first step is to care for the welfare of humanity, and the second is to practice the virtues, the paramitas. That's the path.
seems like we have gone to a system of measure, like how many followers we have, rather than the kind of thing you're talking about, which is what we ought to be doing.
Well, followers are important in the sense that they will keep the work going. But remember, there was only one Apollonius of Tyana during the 1st century AD, and look at the work he had achieved. These sages did not start their career till some of them in their 50s and 40s and so forth. The first part of their life, from childhood up, was spent in learning. And the point here, reiterated, is that if there is one of us that is faithful to the Master's Lodge, holds the line straight, and nothing can move them to let go of that line, then we're safe, because the current would flow and it will not be wasted energy on part of HPB bringing it out. But if we let it die, to reestablish it is very critical, because it takes a lot of energy for those beings to come amongst us and live amongst us to do this work. Because we don't appreciate what they do, we blame them. We look at it, we look at them from our own perspective and think that they're like us, instead of looking from the spiritual perspective and knowing their greatness. We attack them. We try to diminish their power and their position in what they have come to do. Imagine if they got our assistance, how much more they can do, rather than having to fight all this nonsense around them continuously, because we as human beings will not shape up and follow the spiritual path. But there is hope, because the mind is opening up to its greater possibilities. There are pockets of peoples who are living the spiritual life. They will not go with material gain. They want to have a sustainable economy based on real work. And so we have those pockets everywhere. And there is youngsters who have come amongst us who know what they're here to do. So there is hope that those will be greater in number as the centuries go by, and that eventually this philosophy, the divine wisdom, will be generally all and everybody's possession, so that we can actually go forward with the 6th sub-race.
So.
Thank you. Please join us next week again.